The gentleman yields back. Under the Speaker's announced policy of January 5, 2011, the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Carter, is recognized for 60 minutes as the designee of the Majority Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. That was an interesting conversation we just heard. I was very impressed by that. And I agree, we need to expand infrastructure. Everything that was said there is important. You know, I've been talking on the floor of the House about regulations here recently, and as I listened to my Democratic colleagues talk about infrastructure, I was reminded that we have a bunch of new regulations on cement that's going to drive our cement industry out of the country. That's going to be a little tough to build bridges without cement. We've got moratoriums on oil and gas and asphalt's made with oil. So we need to think out these projects as we go forward. And today I'm going to talk about some regulations that I think are going to be, I'm very grateful to be joined by numerous of my colleagues. We are going to talk about some new regulations that are going to be attempted to be imposed upon an industry which is struggling and will, quite honestly, be a setback, in my opinion. But I'm going to start off by recognizing Mr. Günther and let him tell us his comments on the subject of the new 54-mile-per-gallon rules that are being proposed for our automobiles.
Well, I thank the gentleman from Texas, and I thank you for your hard work in trying to protect small job creators, not just in your state, but all across the country, in your proposal of amendments and legislation to try to address what I think is an unjust, over-regulated approach to negatively affecting not just the auto industry, but also the consumer. Earlier last year, the EPA and California regulators, of course, under the guidance and direction of President Obama and his White House, proposed the most expansive regulations ever on the auto industry. Estimates suggest that the cost would be $157 billion. This is at a time, I remind you, when we have a debt and deficit of about 16 trillion and 1.3 to 1.5 trillion respectively. This is not a time when this administration should impose greater oversight, greater regulatory challenges to job creators in America. I want to remind those who are listening, as I take a look at an article written in the Wall Street Journal back in September of last year, September 14th. It talks specifically about this piece of legislation and how new cars and light trucks would have to increase their fuel economy to 54.5 miles a gallon. And the White House officials actually commented in that article. They commented that the proposed fuel efficiency target could raise average vehicle prices by about $3,000. This administration acknowledges that their over-regulation will increase the cost of an average vehicle by $3,000. If you think about that, when an individual goes to purchase or lease a vehicle, they sometimes use a three-year window, maybe a few more months, 39 months. And I find it interesting that we are about to extend the payroll tax for the balance of the year, which would give the average American $1,000 back in their pocket. And the Obama administration would like to take that $1,000 from the consumer pocket and put it back into the coffers at the Treasury. I find that bad public policy, to say the least, not a direction of trying to reduce our debt and deficit and have a pro-growth economy, but I think it stifles the auto industry, and most importantly, it stifles small business owners across the country. And I just want to share with you briefly statistical information about this industry in my state of New Hampshire. We have about 800 different businesses within this industry, 25,000 employees in New Hampshire alone that would be affected by this regulation. I am concerned about the job loss around the country. I'm concerned about small business owners having access to capital, being able to continue to survive through this down economy. And I'm concerned about those employees who work for those job creators, our friends, our neighbors. They're not Republicans or Democrats or independents, they're Americans. And they are demanding that this Congress stop the regulatory oversight from President Obama and his administration, the EPA. And we are trying to do that on behalf of the American public. And I think it's a smart way for us to give back to not just the consumer, but to job creators that we so desperately rely on for a pro-growth economy. The final point that I'd like to make is, in addition to a $3,200 estimated increase of the cost of a vehicle, acknowledged by the President and his White House, this regulation would also essentially take the $15,000 vehicle out of existence. We would not be able to, as consumers, access an affordable vehicle for ourselves or for anybody who's purchasing a vehicle for that matter. The very middle class that our friends on the other side of the aisle talk about preserving and protecting are being targeted by this regulation. And it's time that the country hears more about how this administration chooses to take money from one entity and give it to another. They're taking money from hard-working Americans and filling it in the coffers of the Treasury so they can expand the size and scope of government. And people in New Hampshire have had enough. They've sent me here to fight for those middle-class families, those hard-working job creators, who in New Hampshire provide 25,000 jobs in this industry. And I will continue to work with you and anyone else in this body who shares that opinion that enough with the regulation. Let the free market work. Let the consumer win for a change. And I thank you for yielding your time. And I, again, look forward to working with you on future legislation that you seek to address on the floor of this House.
Thank you. In reclaiming my time, I'd like to agree with absolutely everything you've said. And I think it's a real eye-opener to realize that we sit here and we have a State of the Union address where the middle class was referenced, I don't know, a dozen times probably, that it was all about the middle class and how we were going to do things for the middle class. And I guess we could start off by saying the first thing we're going to do is raise the price of a car for you, $3,200. Not because we have to, not because it even fits our plan for coming up with fuel standards, which we had in place before the EPA and California interfered. No, we're going to do it now, even though it was supposed to be 3 years from now we started looking at these standards. And we're going to take $3,200 out of your pocket when you buy that first car. That doesn't seem to be looking out for the middle class. And I think this House ought to be looking out for the middle class. I think they ought to be looking out for the buyer. I think we ought to realize that in a time when we have an industry that we had to pour literally billions and billions and billions of dollars in to save, and we've done it, we've got it back on, at least we hope, back on its feet, and then all of a sudden, we impose standards upon that industry, which quite honestly will probably harm them. You raise the price of your product, $3,200 that you weren't expecting to raise, you're not ready for that kind of problem. Finally, and most importantly to Texans, the pickup truck capital of the world, I'm told this will eliminate SUVs and pickup trucks. And them's fighting words where we come from. So that's the other thing that we ought to be concerned about. The lifestyle of Americans is going to be changed by requiring standards that some certain vehicles, quite honestly, the engineers tell us we just can't get there. We're not thinking these things out. We're too busy to there's too many people around this town that are too busy trying to get the government in control of your entire life, and they're not thinking out what they're doing. Thank you for your comments. I see my kind of co-partner, Mr. Austria, is here. He and I have been in this battle a good while, and we've done some stuff on the Appropriations Committee to raise this issue. I've got folks who came here ahead of you, but we're kind of co-chairing this thing, so you can make an opening here if you'd like, Steve.
Well, and I thank the gentleman from Texas for yielding, and thank Congressman Carter for his hard work and commitment with this very important issue, and addressing this very important issue that directly impacts hardworking Americans. I know Judge Carter and I worked on an amendment together in committee that try to stop this duplicate government task that is going on right now. And I think you've done a good job in articulating the importance of having that amendment. And I can tell you, Judge, when I fly home every weekend to Ohio, back to my district. Number one, to be home with my family, but also to be out in the district and get what I call my reality check, to talk to our hardworking Ohioans and small business owners, farmers, and like many other members of Congress, you know, I do town halls, I attend 10 different events, meetings, and what do I hear from those hardworking families and those small businesses is that, number one, we have got to stop this out-of-control spending. And part of that includes the wasteful, hard-earned tax dollars because of duplicate services that are going on with different agencies in the government. And number two, we've got to get government out of the way. We've got to stop these unnecessary, burdensome regulations that are hurting small businesses, that are killing jobs. And back in 1979, Congress, this body, tasked NHTSA, the National Highway Transit Service Authority, under the Department of Transportation, that agency, with the task of setting those standards. And those standards were called the Corporate Average Fuel Economy Standards, or CAFE standards. And they were enacted again in 1975 with accountability and transparency with Congress to gradually and responsibly increase the fuel economy in America. And they've been reinforced and raised by Congress repeatedly, as recently as 2007. And what we saw shortly after this administration came in was that the EPA expanded its authority to start setting its own standards. And then they expanded even further, allowing California to create its own state standards. And what's happened here is we've created duplicate services, wasting taxpayers' hard-earned dollars, creating the most expensive regulations ever. You got 3 different agencies, sometimes setting different standards, creating uncertainty in the auto industry, raising the cost of vehicles for hardworking families to pay for this, hurting our small businesses and killing jobs. And last year, again, we saw the EPA, without authorization from Congress, announce proposed rules to regulate the fuel economy of cars and light trucks for model years 2017 to 2025. This is last year, in 2011, they're doing this, to increase the required average fuel economy to over 54 miles per gallon. And because the EPA is not accountable to Congress for this, because they don't have any substantive guidance on how to create these regulations, and they don't have to follow the same rules that were put in place. They're not required to take into account factors like job losses. I mean, we're going through one of the most difficult economies we've seen in decades, unemployment at one of the highest levels it's been, and they don't have to include job losses or consumer demand or safety. And it became very apparent to myself and many of our colleagues that these regulations are out of touch with the American people. They're out of line with Main Street USA, with small businesses that are backbone of this economy. And in some cases, they're irresponsible. And I was proud to join you last July in offering an amendment during our full committee consideration of the Interior, Environment, and Related Agencies bill that simply just put a 1-year timeout on the EPA's rulemaking process so that Congress and our constituents could have time to determine what's the most responsible path here to move forward. And the amendment also prevented the EPA from granting permission to California to creating their own regulations, state regulations, that would lead to an impossible patchwork of state laws. And what this could lead to is, think about this, if you have an activist state, they could actually hijack the federal policy with the regulations they're putting in place. And our amendment was included in the Interior Appropriations Bill. It was reported out of committee. I joined you again in October Judge Carter, and sending a letter to the committee along with 64 of our colleagues, bipartisan support on this, encouraging that this amendment be included as part of the final appropriations package that passed last year. And unfortunately, this administration and their allies in the Senate, the Democrat majority, blocked this common sense amendment, and leaving the EPA with the authority to go out and continue to move forward with this harmful and ill-conceived rule. I think the facts are, and you pointed this out, number one, it's the most expensive regulation ever on the auto industry, $210 billion in new regulations. It's going to raise the average of the cost of the vehicle for a hardworking family by roughly $3,200. It's going to regulate cheaper vehicles that are under $15,000 pretty much out of existence. And the EPA has already wasted over $24 million creating these duplicate regulations. I mean, this is out of control, what's happening right now. It's a waste of the taxpayers' dollars. And we have to, at some point, understand what's happening here, and we're accountable for the taxpayers' dollars. We have to ensure that what way things are being done properly. And the EPA, again, has already spent $24 million, as I mentioned, on these duplicate services. With the largest budget deficit in history, Congress and the administration should focus on eliminating the duplicate government programs, protecting the taxpayers' dollars. The redundant regulations of the fuel economy by the EPA is simply just a magnitude of the government waste that we're seeing today. And with that, Judge Carter, I will yield back to you, and I appreciate, again, your leadership on this very important issue. I know we have a lot of members here to speak on this.
Reclaiming my time, I would now like to have you hear from my colleague from Virginia, Mr. Ridgell, Scott Ridgell from Virginia. He has been waiting to talk. He and I learned in a conversation before we started here tonight, he's been in the automobile business, and so he brings a good perspective to this conversation. I yield the time you may consume.
Well, I thank the gentleman for yielding and for bringing this to our attention, and it's a critical matter facing our country. It has a direct impact on job creation, and I regret that the way it's headed, that impact is adverse. And so we rise tonight, I believe all of us do, in defense of the folks who would be most directly impacted by it, the folks who are producing our cars, the folks who are selling and servicing our cars, and the related industries. You know, I come to this body, and I know we all do, regardless of political affiliation, with the idea that we are first Americans, and I always try to find where do we agree. And I start out tonight thinking we surely agree that it's a good idea for fuel economy standards and performance to increase over time. We share that with our colleagues on the other side, yet that is also regrettably the point of demarcation, because there is a sharp contrast, I believe, between where the administration is headed with this. This is yet a third level of regulation on an industry that is already highly regulated. The Department of Transportation, the state of California itself, and now, and I believe unwisely so, the administration is allowing, in fact, encouraging the EPA to inject itself into this. There are multiple flaws in this path that I believe the administration is on through the EPA. I just want to touch on one, Judge, because as you noted, I've had the privilege of being in this great industry for a long time. Since I was about the age of 23, I've had the privilege of being a retail automobile dealer for about 21 of those years, and through our organizations had the great pleasure of retailing over 100,000 automobiles in our market, and spent a tremendous amount of time on the sales floor. You know, we know this instinctively, that as the price increases, demand will drop. Now, this may be, I think, some noteworthy news to some who are in the regulatory business here, but an additional $30 a month, I've seen it oftentimes, it becomes the stopping point for a family, and rightfully so, as they try to live within a budget. $30 a month, $1 a day, you could say, that is in and of itself enough for a family to make a different purchasing decision. The math is pretty easy with over a $3,000 increase in the vehicle over 60 months. I think my math's pretty good here. It'd be at least $50, not to include interest, on a monthly basis. So on the margin, we would see in dealerships across this country decisions to not buy cars. The higher the price, the fewer the buyers. Now, that which seems so obvious to us, let me read from the regulations itself here, from the regulations. The administration's proposed regulation states, quote, "Since the impact of this proposal on sales is unknown and sales have the largest potential effect on employment," here's the point of note, "the impact of this proposal on employment is also unknown." Judge, I'd submit to you tonight, well, the EPA and the Obama administration may not understand the impact of these regulations on employment, but I do. I think the American people do. Sales go down. Employment follows. The only thing that increases is the pain, real pain and suffering of American families is on the margin. Some employers have to tighten up. Some manufacturers have to tighten up because of the decreased demand. So, Judge, I stand with you tonight. I applaud your leadership in this matter, and I hope that the EPA will reconsider, in fact, come to a full stop and allow the CAFE standards that have been in place since 2007 to guide us going forward. They're doing a good job. Manufacturers are improving in their fuel economy standards. It's a wise course of action to stay where we are, and I thank you again for your leadership, and I yield back.
I'm reclaiming my time and thanking my colleague for his comments. We're talking to this whole year about how we're going to get this economy back on its feet, how we're going to put people back to work, how we're going to think out make our decisions make sense to put people to work and make our economy grow. And I'm concerned when we already had the NHTSA or whatever it's called, setting these standards. We had CAFE standards established, gosh, that's 8 years ago, with a plan to study on down the road, looking at the economic consequences and the job consequences as well as the environmental consequences. And the EPA chose to make a decision based solely on their global warming view of the world and not take into effect the job. In fact, they say in their statement, we don't even know what the job consequences are going to be, and we don't know what the economic consequences are going to be, and we don't know if you can sell a car $3,200, but we're passing this regulation anyway. That's not the kind of decisions we ought to be making around this place. So I really thank you for raising those economic points, Scott. It helps a lot. The next person I believe was here, Alan Nunley was the next one. Alan, my good friend from Mississippi.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, Mr. Carter, for yielding. Mr. Speaker, I have to confess, when Judge Carter started talking about Texans loving their pickup trucks and the EPA coming to take our pickup trucks away, that got my attention. Because the judge would know that while Texans love their pickup trucks, the only reason that you love them more is because there's more Texans than there are Mississippians. I love my truck as well, and I don't want anybody to come get it. The EPA, California regulators, and the Obama White House have combined forces to show how far the left will go. They'll use any means at their disposal to ram through its liberal agenda. I'm convinced that this administration is driven by a radical environmental agenda, and that this environmental agenda will use the threat of allowing California to impose its own set of regulations as a way to strong-arm auto manufacturers into going along with the new and unnecessary fuel economy standards. As has already been described here tonight, Mr. Speaker, this action will drive up the cost of a vehicle by an average of $3,200. Now, my concern is that young family in Mississippi that's trying to make it on their own, that needs to go out and purchase a new vehicle. For that young family, $3,200 is a lot of money. My concern is a senior citizen that needs to go out and purchase a new vehicle and they're trying to make ends meet on limited income, for that senior citizen, $3,200 is a lot of money. My concern is for those manufacturing workers in Mississippi that are making vehicles tonight. And when the cost of those vehicles go up by $3,200, common sense says there's going to be less demand. And we've got automobile manufacturers and their suppliers that are a vital part of Mississippi's economy. Now, Congress has granted sole authority to regulate fuel economy to the Department of Transportation. And all this proposal is a backdoor attempt to implement cap and trade. But there's even a larger issue here. The larger issue is about a president and the ideology he represents that is obsessed with expanding Washington's control over every facet of our life. They've dictated what kind of light bulbs we use. Now they're trying to say what kind of vehicles we drive, what kind of health insurance we purchase, whether you can be forced to provide medical services that even violate your religious beliefs. Their attitude is that regulators know more about what families need than individuals. Mr. Speaker, it's time to stand up. It's time to say no more. When they're coming for my pickup truck, the answer is no. I yield back.
I thank my colleague for yielding back, and I would now like to recognize my good friend Steve Pierce from New Mexico, our Texas's good neighbor to the west.
Thank the gentleman for yielding, and thanks for his leadership on this work. To adequately assess exactly what the effects are going to be of increasing the CAFE standards from 35 to 54 miles per gallon requires that we take a look at the increase that we had just in 2007, the increase that moved us to 35 miles per gallon. We had testimony that declared that at least one auto manufacturer would go out of business, would file bankruptcy if that law was actually implemented. That was because we do not have the technical capability to enforce and to build the vehicles that would take us to 35 miles per gallon. In order to reach that objective, then, the auto manufacturers were going to arbitrarily have to price their lower mileage vehicles. They raise the price on them to drive demand down. That is, they sell fewer. It's not that we're actually increasing the mileage, it's that we're selling fewer of the larger vehicles like pickup trucks that are used in the oil field, on ranching operations. So we wanted to depress down the demand for them while simultaneously adding stimulus to the lower cost vehicles. Now, the problem with that for a business is that the profits are made from those vehicles that are like pickup trucks and the SUVs. So this government was in the process of mandating that the manufacturers would build fewer of the high-profit vehicles and more of the low-profit vehicles. That's the only way they could comply with the government standards, and it was therefore going to decrease profits enough to put at least one of the manufacturers into bankruptcy. As it turned out, 2 of the 3 manufacturers in America filed bankruptcy. 2 of the 3. The taxpayers went in and had to bail them out. So when the president in his State of the Union last week talked about not bailing out companies, he spoke out of the other side of his mouth later in the speech by saying that the company we bailed out in General Motors was such a great success. It is not a great success when taxpayers have to subsidize the processes declared by the U.S. government. If that's what happened when we moved the mileage from 20 to 35 miles per gallon, imagine the distress in the auto industry when we moved to 54. The Prius does not even qualify It does not reach 54 miles per gallon. The Toyota Yaris only gets 38 miles per gallon. The technology does not exist. So the same geniuses in the White House that brought us the cash for clunkers are now going to bring us 54 mile per gallon requirements for fuel standards. The reason that the United States economy is faltering and suffering is because of what is happening by government agencies. The unfairness for the lower class people in this country is ghastly. The president sat on this floor, he stood on this floor last week and talked about fairness to everyone, economic fairness. Then let the president hear his own words. He made fun of one of his agencies that declared milk to be a hazardous substance. He made fun of the regulation which got so much attention that it was rolled back. Let the president make fun of this regulation because it's going to kill the car manufacturers. They cannot make cars that go 54 miles to the gallon. And for those who say, just make the rule and they'll develop it, I simply say, let's pay our EPA workers, all of those involved in this process, let's simply start paying them with General Motors stock. Let them find out in their own lives exactly what their value of their opinions and their designs are. The final problem with the implementation of this rule is the constitutionality. Our founding fathers set up a system of checks and balances. The president would sign legislation. The Senate and the House would pass the legislation, but they had to pass exactly the same bill. No one house, no one branch could dominate the others. Now what the president is doing is taking his beliefs, his agendas outside that set up by the founding fathers, that would guarantee voters would have input. And he's moving it into an extraterritorial agencies that have no controls by the taxpayers and no controls by the voters. The president should be ashamed of what he's suggesting. The president is causing our Constitution to be set on a shelf. The Constitution is here not for the rich. The Constitution is here for the poor. The Constitution is that which gives the poor standing in this country. The rich can always have their way. The powerful can always get their way. But the Constitution defends and protects the poor. So when the president crassly sets aside the Constitution, he's working against the fairness economically, the fairness constitutionally of this nation towards 99% of its inhabitants. I think that it is time for this Congress and this House to stand up and tell the president no more. You will bypass the Constitution no more. And we need to mean business, and we need to back our words up with actions. I yield back to my friend from Texas. Thank you.
I thank my friend from New Mexico for a very, very strong statement. Now I want to recognize Mr. Roscoe Bartlett, my friend from Maryland. He wants to get up here with some of his own charts, and I'm going to step aside and let him do it.
Thank you very much for yielding. I've sat and listened to this discussion, and I am reminded of how futile efforts are to try to get something done by doing it wrong two different ways. The president believes that we need higher CAFE standards, and he is going to impose those through regulations from the EPA. He is also assuming that the American people don't have the sense to understand that they need to have higher CAFE standards, so he's going to force them on it. And without trying to educate the American people, he's just going to tell them, you need to trust me, you need higher CAFE standards, and this is what it's going to be. What the president is doing is illegal and illogical And I don't think that the American people are going to stand for it. I just have a couple of charts here that put in context why we need to look at CAFE standards. And if the president would use this approach, the American people would do the right thing relative to the kind of car they buy when they understand the environment that the United States and the world is in. Here I have two charts, and they're from the IEA, the International Energy Association. This is a creature of the OECD. It is perhaps, maybe along with our Energy Information Administration, a part of our Department of Energy, the best followers and prognosticators of energy in the world. And this is their world oil production, this is their world energy outlook, and this one is in 2008. And I just want to point to a couple of things here. First of all, the oil that we're now pumping, and you could go back here 150 years with this blue thing here, and it started back at zero, and it pumped more and more and more and more. And here we are today pumping this much oil. These are the conventional oil fields that we're pumping oil from now. We're also getting some natural gas liquids, and you see that curve is growing, and it is growing. This is not gas in your gas tank. This is propane and butane and gases like that. The green here is non-conventional oil, and we're having a lot of discussion of non-conventional oil now about the Keystone Pipeline and bringing the oil from the tar sands of Alberta, Canada down. We're going to build a pipeline. It's either going to be in this country or it's going to be across Canada through the Rocky Mountains. If the environmentalists are worried about environmental impact, they ought to be thinking about what's going to happen to the environment when they put a pipeline through the Rocky Mountains. And so either we're going to get that cheap oil, or the Chinese are going to get that cheap oil. And the environment, they're going to have a pipeline. We're not going to avoid a pipeline. There's going to be a pipeline. You know, I just think that common sense comes down on the side, gee, I'd like that oil. And I think, well, I'd like the jobs that go with getting that oil. So, you know, and I am concerned about the environment, but there's going to be a pipeline. That's a given. And it's either going to be here or it's going to be in Canada, and I think it's going to be more environmentally insult going through the Rocky Mountains than down through the Mississippi Valley with that pipeline. Okay. So that green area is non-conventional oil, and that is increasing, and it will increase. Some of you see it's not a big fraction of what we get. Notice that we've been stagnated here for 5 years now at 84 million barrels. We call it oil, but it's more than oil because it's natural gas liquids too. And the world has not been able to produce any more oil than 84 million barrels a day, which is why oil is about $100 a barrel, and we're in a recession. And it's still stuck at about $100 a barrel. Okay, they prognosticate that the production from current fields is going to go down fairly dramatically. You see it dropping off there. But not to worry, because we're going to get a lot of oil from the fields that we discovered, the light blue here, but are too tough to develop. And then we're going to get a fair amount of oil from fields we have yet to discover, the bright red there. This is kind of a nice dream, isn't it? We're going to discover. Oh, by the way, the dark red here is enhanced oil recovery. It really ought to be a part of this. That's putting CO2 down there or live steam or something down there to get a little bit more oil out. Note that here by 2030, they're prognosticating that we're going to be up at 106 million barrels of oil a day. Now, this chart has disappeared. If you go on the internet and try to find that chart, it's not there. It was there. That's where we got it. But they're a little embarrassed by its presence because just 2 years later, in 2010, they made this prognostication. Same people. Now, by 2035, 5 years later, instead of having 106 million barrels of oil a day, they're up to only 96 million barrels of oil a day. And notice they've now incorporated the enhanced oil recovery here with conventional oil, and notice a fairly precipitous drop-off. Now, they're telling you that the production of oil is not going to decrease because we're going to get huge amounts of oil from the fields that we've now discovered but too tough to develop, like under 7,000 feet of water and 30,000 feet of rock in the Gulf of Mexico. A lot of discoveries like that, and fields yet to be discovered. I think there's little probability that these two wedges are going to occur. I think what's going to happen is that this curve is going to tip over and start down. Let me tell you why I think that's true. Because the United States reached its plateau, which is called peak oil, reached its plateau in 1970. And that was predicted in 1956, but what I think was the most important speech of the last century given by M. King Hubbard in 1956. He says, 14 years from now, in 1970, the United States will reach its maximum oil production. After that, it will drop off. And it did. Now, he didn't predict the discovery of any oil in the Gulf of Mexico and in Alaska. And here we see there was a little blip in the slide down with the huge amounts of oil we found in Alaska. And remember the fabled discoveries of oil in the Gulf of Mexico, the yellow there, that's all it did. We now produce half the oil that we did in 1970. I do not think the world is any more resourceful or creative than the United States. If we could not reverse this downtrend in our country, I do not think that the world will be able to reverse it worldwide, which is why I say that the world is going to follow what the United States did. And by the way, this was predicted by M. King Hubbard. He said that the world would be peaking about now. Your government has paid for 4 studies that said this is going to happen. And I have just a quote here from one of those studies. And this was the first big study. This was the SAIC report called the Hirsch Report. World oil peaking is going to happen, they said. Peaking is when you reach this plateau and after that it falls off. And they said the peaking of oil is going to happen. Oil peaking presents a unique challenge. The world has never faced a problem like this. I just have one more chart here, and these are some quotes from what I think is the most insightful speech of the last century. The most important one, I think, was given by M. King Hubbard on the 6th day of March in 1956. This speech given just a bit later, the 15th day of May in 1957, a speech given by Hyman Rickover, the creator of our nuclear submarines. There's nothing man can do to rebuild exhausted fossil fuel reserves. They were created by solar energy 500 million years ago and took eons to grow to their present volume. In the face of the basic fact that fossil fuel reserves are finite, the exact length of time these reserves will last is important in only one respect. The longer they last, the more time do we have to invent ways of living off renewable or substitute energy sources. We've been trying to do that, haven't we? And to adjust our economy to the vast changes which we can expect from such a shift. By the way, this talk was given to a group of physicians in St. Paul, Minnesota. If you simply Google for Rickover energy speech, the speech will come up. They lost it for several years. It's now back on the internet. In another place in this speech, he said that in the 8,000-year recorded history of man, the age of oil would be but a blip. And wow, what a ride it's been. What a ride it's been. The quality of life that we have as a result of using these fossil fuels has just been incredible. Just one last quote from what I think was the most insightful speech of the last century. I love this quote. Fossil fuels resemble capital in the bank. A prudent and responsible parent will use his capital sparingly in order to pass on to his children as much as possible of his inheritance. A selfish and irresponsible parent will squander it in riotous living and care not one whit how his offspring will fare. I think what our president needs to do is to educate the American people to the situation we're in. If these charts truly represent that situation, the American people will voluntarily say, Mr. President, we need to respond to that in a responsible way. The president doesn't need to assume that you're ignorant and can't understand, or to assume that he has to tell us what we ought to do. Thank you, and I yield back.
I'd now like to recognize Mr. Manzullo from Illinois, who is a champion of starting up the manufacturing again in this country, and he understands the economy and how it works. Mr. Manzullo.
I thank the gentleman from Texas for yielding. Mr. Speaker, we have something very interesting going on in this administration, and it's called Who's in Charge? At one time, we believed that the National Highway Transportation Safety Agency, NHTSA, as part of DOT, was in charge of regulating the corporate average fuel economy standards. In fact, it's always been that way. Well, then all of a sudden, EPA gets involved, gets its nose under the tent, and decides that, well, because there are emissions, that they're going to get involved in it. Then along comes the California Air Resources Board and say, oh, no. If you live in California, these are the standards. And so we have the automobile manufacturers taking a look at which agency is in control, if any. and what they have to follow, although they have been forced to follow the standard that's been set down by the EPA to have this amazing 54.5 miles per gallon fuel economy for model years beginning 2017. In the district that I'm proud to represent, Chrysler has a plant on Belvedere that's going to house the body shop for the new Dodge Dart. I saw that automobile at the auto show here in Washington this past week, and it's a beauty. It's beautiful. It represents more than a $600 million investment in the community and workforce in Northern Illinois. And Chrysler will add more than 1,600 production workers at the same assembly plant starting in July when they add the third shifts. And this is another signal of the increase in automobile sales that we're seeing in this country, from the zenith of 17 million that were sold years ago to where we are now. But this car starts at $16,000. And with the average price of a vehicle to increase by $3,200, and the source of that is the government itself, I just don't know what these people are thinking. In fact, if you take a look at the EPA rule that says the estimate is that the mandate will cost $157 billion, which always means the number is vastly greater. That's a lot of money. That's a huge amount of money. The fuel economy rule is, I mean, this is classic Obama EPA, but you ask yourself, well, what is $157 billion for? And the great scientists, mathematicians, and bureaucrats over at EPA said, well, this is the cost that it's going to take in investing in new technology. Oh, I hear those words, investing in new technology, as if people that don't even know the sweet smell of machine oil, who sit in offices in Washington, D.C., can sit there with their calculators and their green hats, green clerk's hats, and come to an estimate of what it's going to cost to increase the technology to come up to that 54.5 mile per gallon standard. We all know government figures are wrong. I mean, $157 billion, that's a huge amount of money. I think the total amount of the bailout, if anybody was interested in that, was around $15 billion. Now this is 10 times the amount. And you ask yourself, where's this money coming from? Obviously, if manufacturers have to gear up for this major expense, they're not going to wait until 2017. They're going to start doing it now. And so the increase in prices of automobiles will be directly related to this new mandate from the EPA. And so the gentleman from Texas, I want to thank you for having the courage of speaking out here, and I thank you for the opportunity to help explain to the American people the foil. I guess that's a good word, the foil, the folly, rather, of this latest EPA action. And I yield back.
And I thank my friend for yielding back his time and for his great comments. And, you know, one of the things I like to say about Washington is the shortage of common sense. And Mr. Manzullo, I think you made a good common sense argument that we can understand. And now I'd like to represent my friend Mr. Kelly from Pennsylvania and hear what he has to say on this interesting new challenge the Obama administration has given us.
And I thank the gentleman from Texas for yielding. You know, I come from a family that in 1953 started in the automobile business. My father came from being a parts picker for General Motors in a warehouse, surviving World War II, and then coming back home and starting his own dealership in 1953. So not only can I talk the talk, I've actually walked the walk. And when we sit back and we see what this administration is doing, while they say on one side they're very concerned with jobs and they're very concerned with the recovery of the automobile industry, they propose legislation that will take 7 million buyers out of the market. That is a staggering number of cars that we will not be able to build. If we can't build them, we don't need folks there in the factories. We don't want to mess with the fragile recovery that the automobile industry has right now. And again, as I said, having walked that walk and understanding the cost of these vehicles as they go up, it is a terrible thing that this administration is concerning. Now, it does not surprise me because we are talking about people who have never in their life actually had their own skin in the game. So when they talk about these measures that they're taking, when they talk about all these well-intentioned ideas, they forget that the ultimate sacrifice made is by the buyers, by the American consumer. We are going to raise the average cost of these vehicles by $3,200. As I said earlier, 7 million prospective buyers will not be in the market. We have jumped the standards that we had by 3 years. Now, I was there in the early 70s when the CAFE standards came into existence. The corporate average fuel economy had nothing to do with green energy, had nothing to do with a footprint, a carbon footprint. What it had to do was our reliance on foreign oil. We are making great strides in that effect. Now, I do know that my friends in the automobile manufacturing business have agreed to these new standards. I also know that there's so many resets in this new standard that they opted to go ahead along with this administration's directions and bought into this idea, knowing that each electric car that they build, which is subsidized by $7,500 in taxpayer funds, hard-working American families that pay their taxes, will not have the same benefit. The people buying these cars, the electric cars, the metrics on that is $175,000. That's their average income. So who are we appealing to? Now, we give the industry a double count on those. That's how they get to the 54.5 miles per gallon. And they understand with the resets that it's much easier to go along with this administration than to try to fight them up front. But I will tell you that my friends in the automobile dealer business, the folks that go to work every day, that have to put bread on the table, and in my dealership, there's 110 folks that come in there every day to solve the needs, the transportation needs of the people in our community. Now, the other side of this is safety. When my wife and my 4 children get in their cars, and keep in mind there's 5 grandchildren involved now, we're going to start asking those folks to start driving lighter cars. Cars that will not be as safe as the cars we have on the road right now. And why? Because we are catering to an administration. We're catering to an administration that puts their agenda ahead of the American public safety. So I appreciate what the gentleman from Texas is doing. I understand the unintended consequences of this. And it's time for us to blow the whistle on an administration that refuses to acquiesce to what the public needs and continues to drive their own agenda. So I appreciate what you've done, and I yield back my time, sir.
And reclaiming my time, I'd like to ask the gentleman a question, because it just dawned on me the economics that you're describing here. We're not saying, what they're doing now is they're not saying, okay, we're going to make a Chevrolet pickup or a Ford pickup that gets 54.5 miles per gallon. What they're saying is, yeah, we still got a Ford pickup or a Chevrolet pickup or a Chrysler pickup that gets 20 miles, 18, 20 miles a gallon. But hey, look at all these electric cars that don't use any gasoline, so we get an offset for those. And you said the market for these is people with the rich people. That 1% that everybody's complaining about,
exactly.
The only ones can afford to buy these electric cars.
And I would respond.
They're
to
the market, and yet
absolutely.
That's how they get this number down, but it's not real. It's imaginary.
The loopholes in this program are not for the hardworking American families that go to work every day to support their kids and their families and their well-being. It's for folks that really don't buy these cars to drive, but they buy them because they can. We are giving people $7,500 in federal loopholes, and then in my state of Pennsylvania, Pennsylvania throws another $3,500 towards the purchase of an electric car. Now, those cars, by the way, it's 200,000 cars per manufacturer, not 200,000 cars in total, 200,000 cars per manufacturers. The cost of this, as you see the trajectory of this expense, it goes off the charts. And the answer is, it is not going to improve fuel economy. What really drives fuel economy is the number of miles you drive each year and the cost of gasoline. So as they start to talk about, no, we've got to tell people that they can only drive a car that gets 54.5 miles per gallon. And you know, sir, as well as I do, that is not the case. We've been gamed again. I think the American people now, there should be an outrage over this. This is a regulation that does nothing but pushes an agenda and does not push the well-being of the American citizens.
That is a real eye-opener, and I thank you for explaining that. I didn't really get that concept. And so, in addition of playing games with numbers, we're subsidizing the playing games of numbers. but the federal government, and then in your state, your state also subsidizes it. I hope Texas doesn't, but heck, who knows?
Well, and again, I appreciate the gentleman for bringing up this topic, and we have to understand that if we are really going to get this economy back on track, it is the people who make things, and we talk about made in America. If we're really trying to support the domestic automakers, then you don't raise the price of the car by $3,200. With each price increase, we eliminate somebody who would have bought a new car. As we eliminate the purchase of new cars, we also affect the long-range market for used cars. A new car eventually becomes a used car. We are eliminating transportation, personal transportation in this country by upping the bar in a systematic way, and people aren't noticing it. There should be an outrage among the hard-working American families who sometimes dad works 2 jobs, mom works a job, all to put food on the table, educate their children, and somehow get them from where they live to where they need to be, whether it be for their job or for education or for after-school activities. We are eliminating private transportation in this country by upping the price and making it impossible for the average American to own his own car.
That's shocking. And you know, I do remember that the car that we drive, that my wife and I are driving right now, cost more than our first 3-bedroom, 2-bath house that we purchased when our first 2 children were born. Yeah. That's kind of shocking as to what all these gamesmanship, how that can drive that price up. And I did have a person in the transportation business was telling me, I'm not going to disclose what it was, but he was saying they do studies on selling tickets to ride, it was the air industry, on a plane. And that their ticket price is the price at which they know people will fly. And they have done studies to determine, add $10 in some instances to that price, the ticket that people will fly, you lose like 18%. Absolutely. Add $50, you can lose half of your flying public. Well, now, that's how much the margin is, and you got the same kind of deal in the automobile industry.
It's all price point, and it's all affordability, and it comes down to how much per month does it cost for the average hardworking American family to keep private transportation. We are raising the price $3,200 per car. We are eliminating 7 million people, giving them the opportunity to own their own car, their own transportation, which has been the hallmark of this country and which has driven this economy for many, many years and allowed the people to move out of the cities into the suburbs because they had a way to get to work. They didn't have to rely on public transportation. In this country, it's very unique, is that you can get up in the morning and you can drive to wherever it is you want to go, and you can get there by yourself or with your friends. But that's the uniqueness and that's the greatness of America. And it has always been, and it is the one thing that the rest of the world looks at. Private transportation is absolutely critical, and we're going to eliminate the opportunity for 7 million Americans to have that opportunity.
There is an agenda that is being sold here. Reclaiming my time, in testimony we had before the Appropriations Subcommittee on Transportation that I happened to serve on, we've talked to our former colleague, about their vision, this administration's vision of the world they want us to live in. And they want us all to live in high-rise apartments and take public transportation. They will tell you straight out, that's the future of America. Concentrate. And there have been at least some of the administration who have said the days of the 2-story home in the suburbs are over. I don't know if America knows that. And this is a perfect example of part of the plan to drive us out of the suburbs and into concentrated population where the only solution is public transportation. And quite honestly, where I live, that's not going to be very popular.
No, and I agree with the gentleman, and I would tell you that I join in your fight. This is not only a fight that we must fight, this is a battle we must win. And I will fight with you every step of the way. We cannot continue to take a free and self-governing people and tell them not only what foods they can eat, what house they can live in, what light bulb they can use, or what car or truck they can drive. So I thank you for being a champion of the American people and the hardworking Americans that pay for every single thing that this government does. I thank you, sir.
And I thank you, Mr. Kelly. Representative Kelly, I will be glad to have you in the fight. You're a man I'd stand back to back with any day.
Thank you, sir. And I yield back my time.
And Mr. Speaker, we have been here talking about something that many of us realize is a shocking change of our world. It seems a small thing, but 54.5 miles per gallon, everyone will tell you the kind of cars we drive in Texas, which is pickup trucks, they can never get there. They can't gear and torque to get to that number, 54.5. Therefore, unless we pull this scam that was being talked about of every electric car offsets the pickup trucks, we're in trouble. So I yield back the balance of my time and thank the Speaker for his patience.
The gentleman yields back. Members are reminded